This series of videos is designed to assist players in learning LWRS or Bewegungskrieg. The training video is applicable to the standard version of LWRS and all reformatted versions of LWRS called Bewegungskrieg. Part 4 covers indirect fire combat. Indirect fire occurs during the artillery subphase. Some aircraft conduct air-to-ground attacks which are considered as indirect fire combat, but these are covered in the various aircraft videos and will not be covered here. In summary, all indirect fire must be conducted before any direct fire is conducted. This is the rules which describe dedicated artillery, which would typically be mortars. Upon reading this more carefully, I am assuming that artillery elements which are in base-to-base contact and move with the battalion are counted as heavy weapons elements, while if they do not move with the battalion, they can act as artillery elements. I will discuss the nuances of this later in the video. The basic rules identify three types of artillery: light, medium and heavy. If using the optional rules, there is a very light artillery, which is 60 mil or less. On the surface, the rules allow 5 cm mortars to conduct indirect fire, but the effect should be less than 8 cm mortars, thus the extra class of extra light or grade 1. Players may obviously choose to ignore this. I'm uncertain if the designers intended these light mortars to ever be part of the rules and may have assumed they should all be embedded with the infantry or heavy weapons companies. However, some nationalities did group these light mortars together, such as the Russians, so both options should be allowed. That is, players should be allowed to use their 5 cm mortars as heavy weapons elements or as artillery elements as they desire. Heavy, or grade 4, fires with 4 FPs or 4 D6 dice. Mediums with 3 FPs or 3 D6 dice. Light with 2 FPs or 2 D6 dice. And if using the optional rules, the extra light with 1 FP or 1 D6 dice. The firepower value represents, as you can see, the number of dice you use when conducting indirect fire. As with most fire combat, a hit requires a result of 4 to 6 on a D6 dice. If an element suffers a hit, it may attempt a save throw, which by default requires a 5 to 6. However, unlike a hit, the defenders do possess a number of modifiers to this die roll. It should be noted that for the 2 hits to disorder rules, even if the hit was saved, it still counts for the total of 2 hits to disorder. The defensive points modifier for indirect fire differ from those used for direct fire. Half of them are similar, but 3 are unique to indirect fire. For each defensive point, you add 1 to your die roll. So with 1 defensive point, a D6 result of 4 to 6 will save. With 2 defensive points, it becomes 3 to 6. Finally, if infantry is deployed, entrenched and in built-up areas, it becomes 2 to 6. It's possible for the defensive points modifiers to make a loss impossible. In these cases, a house rule that 1 always results in a loss may be used. I do not find this house rule necessary, but many players may think otherwise. The purpose of indirect fire, in the main, is to disorder a close combat opponent. This is either in a defensive position or when conducting an attack. In this example, we have a Polish battalion defending against a German attack by 2 battalions. Both sides have a dedicated medium mortar element, which will provide indirect fire or artillery fire. During the movement phase, the German Panzer battalion moves 10 centimeters and finds itself in contact with the Polish battalion. The German motorized infantry battalion moves 10 centimeters and ends up behind the German Panzer battalion. From this position, it can conduct direct fire into the Polish battalion. The 8 cm mortar, which is part of the motorized infantry battalion, is not moving and is deployed from the previous game turn, as it's considered an artillery element. The owning player could consider it a heavy weapons element, but does not in this case. During the support phase, the German mortar conducts indirect fire against the Polish infantry battalion, and the Polish mortar does the same against the German Panzer battalion. The mortars are light, so both have 2 FPs or use 2 D6 dice. A 4 to 6 will result in a hit, and on average you would expect a hit against each target. The Polish player attempts a save, which is normally a 5 to 6. It has 2 defensive points, so the die roll of 3 to 6 will save it. If the Polish player fails, its battalion becomes disorders. If it succeeds, it will not. The German player attempts a save, which is normally 5 to 6. The German tanks are light, so gain 1 defensive points. So a die roll of 4 to 6 will save. Once again, if the German fails to save, it's disordered. Otherwise, it's not. If the Polish battalion is not disordered, the direct fire combat would have 3 Polish elements, each with 1 FP against the German, for a total of 3 D6 dice. If disordered, this is halved to 1 D6 dice as you round down. In summary, if a Polish battalion is disordered, it would be very unlikely to win this close combat. If one side suffers a disorder while disordered, it has lost the combat, so the aim is to get the second disorder. If the Polish battalion was disordered, it could never achieve this. If it was not disordered, it has an outside chance of achieving this. If the German battalion is not disordered, the direct fire combat would have 3 German Panzer IIs, each with 1 FP against the Polish. This is because they have an AT weapon with no HE. In addition, the Panzer Grenadier can conduct direct fire with 3 elements, each with 1 FP against the Polish. The Germans can spin 6 D6 dice if not disordered, or 4 D6 dice if the Panzers are disordered. The Panzers can still win in either case. If the German side was disordered or not, it could still achieve 2 hits, which would disorder the Polish battalion. It's much harder if the Panzers are disordered. In conclusion, if the German can disorder the Polish battalion with artillery fire, it should win the close combat after 1 round. If the Polish can disorder the Germans with artillery fire and is itself not disordered, it has a chance of winning the combat. Otherwise, it has no chance. Light mortars are an interesting weapon system. While players can make them into heavy weapons elements, they can also use them as artillery. This chart shows the ranges on the right under the IDE or indirect element, FR or fire range column. Light mortars have a range of between 5 cm and 18 cm. In practical terms, an artillery element should have a range of 16 cm or a minimum of 10 cm to be useful in offence. In defence, as long as the range is greater than 3 cm, it can be used in a defensive situation. The reason why we have this range limitation is artillery elements move during the artillery movement subphase, which means they cannot move during the normal movement phase. They also need to be deployed, which expends an action. Finally, the artillery movement subphase occurs after the artillery subphase, so it has to be ready for fire at the beginning of the game turn. Let's look at an example. In game turn 1, the Germans move to within attack range, which is 10 cm in this case. If the Germans were on foot, this would be 6 cm, which means they would suffer direct fire before they would make their attack move. Because the Polish lack anti-tank weapons, the German panzers are safe from long-range direct fire, and the infantry are outside of visibility range, so are also safe. In game turn 1, during the artillery movement subphase, the Germans move their artillery element, expending an action into place and then spending a second action to deploy. If it fails to deploy, it would be used as a heavy weapon element in game turn 2. This is when you keep your divisional command around to allow for a second action die roll. If it failed, the Germans could also delay their attack by 1 game turn. There's no real downside apart from the loss of a game turn. If the Germans had a SP mortar element, it becomes even easier. And if it's on foot or horse-drawn, then it has to delay because you can't do a second action in that case. During the movement phase of game turn 2, the Germans now close with the Polish battalion. If they are unable to deploy the mortars, then this would be game turn 3. As you can see, the mortars need a range which is at least the distance covered by the movement into attack, plus the thickness of the attacking battalions. In most cases, you would attack with 2 lines of elements. The result is 16 centimetres in that case. If an attack was done on foot, the numbers are 6 centimeters to move into contact, plus 6 centimeters, which is the thickness of two lines of elements. The result is 12 centimeters. If attacking with only a single line of elements, then this could drop to 9 centimeters, but this is the absolute minimum range required. Based on this limitation, the 60mm mortars are suitable for attack, but all the others are not. But they can be used for defence, because in defence you do not move. In this case, the Polish light mortar has a range of 8 centimeters, so it can be placed 5 centimeters behind the rear of its parent battalion, and still provides support by being able to conduct artillery fire against the German panzers. While I feel the ability to use light mortars as artillery is a good idea, classing them the same as 8cm mortars is not reasonable. This is why I suggest reducing their FP value from 2 FPs to 1 FP. The range difference limitation is not sufficient. I would also class 60mm mortars as 1 FP, although players may choose to make the cutoff 59mm. My scenarios do not use this optional rules, but I will change that in the future. Players can do whatever they so desire. Artillery support is all about disordering the enemy battalion, so any subsequent close combat can be won easily. This can also be achieved by aircraft support, or catching infantry in the open without support, or actually catching armour in a claustrophobic situation without support. This concludes part 4 of my LWRS training video series. I have no idea what part 5 will be, but I'm sure it'll be good. Denken Sie daran, immer vor Heimatland zu kämpfen. Lightning War Red Storm was written by Andrew Stevenson. The current version, designed for both World War II and modern conflicts, is dated 2013. However, earlier versions were available as early as 2008. The rules use company-size elements, each consisting of 3 steps or strength points. These elements form battalions, and the basic combat unit is the battalion. The combat system uses a simple lots of D6 combat mechanism, and the sequence of play is an initiative-based movement phase system, followed by a fire phase. There is nothing revolutionary, but the package works very well. Bewegungskrieg version 1 is a reformatted version of the original rules with errata. Included are any corrections, additional numbering, updated tables, and additional cross-referencing. There is no changes to the original rules. All credits for the game design and rules go to Andrew Stevenson. Bewegungskrieg version 2 is an enhanced version of the original rules with errata. Included are any corrections, additional numbering, updated tables, and additional cross-referencing. Also included are optional rules such as terrain, weather, setup, or any other rules which fill gaps in the original rules. This version of the rules includes additional diagrams, figures, and commentary. The original rules are unchanged, but additional rules have been added to fill any gaps. Any credit for the game system and design goes to Andrew Stevenson. Allen guten Dingo gehen zu Ende.